Across recorded history, the vast majority of human societies have independently developed beliefs in gods or a god. This video examines the philosophical arguments offered for God's existence and the psychological mechanisms, cognitive, existential, and motivational, that explains why these arguments resonate. It's going to be what the argument is in philosophy and theology, and then the psychology followed up right after. So, this analysis will proceed on two levels. First, the logical structure and the standard objections to each argument. Second, the psychological factors, including cognitive biases, existential needs, and well-being functions that influence why people find certain arguments persuasive. So this is sort of going to be a dissection of what people feel and think when it comes to arguments for and against God's existence and stuff like that. It's not going to be a anthropological study, sort of. It's more going to be, we look at the arguments and then we are going to unpack why people will use those arguments when asked to explain why they believe what they believe. First, the cosmological argument. The cosmological argument holds that everything which exists has a cause. The universe exists and began to exist, therefore it requires a cause outside itself, and this is commonly identified as God. This argument was made famous by William Lane Craig, obviously. The common objection is the infinite regress objection. So, a standard objection is whether or not it has to terminate in God, this long causal chain. Why is it God at the beginning of the chain rather than something else or just an infinite regress? Causal reasoning and meaning making. Humans show a strong innate tendency to seek causal explanations. This was demonstrated by Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman most saliently. And existential psychology suggests this extends beyond mere cognition. Identifying a quote-unquote first cause can also serve a deeper need to locate one's existence within a coherent, meaningful narrative. So narrative psychology also makes this claim. When people are making arguments or providing their reasons for believing in things, the deeper reason is more often a kind of identity narrative, and it keeps their worldview coherent. And a coherent worldview provides certainty. It's like if you've ever gone to a shop and they offered you 50 items versus 3 items, the more uncertainty there is with what action to take, the more paralyzing that can be, and that has consequences. So that's why people hold on to their worldviews. Like, that's the fundamental reason. When it comes to existential reasoning, it often manifests itself in the form of narrative psychology. And this causal reasoning, this causal chain reasoning, is a very powerful way to ground the narrative that people may have for their lives, because we have an intuitive reason to believe in causal chains in the way that we do. So not only does it mesh well with our psychology and our neuropsychology, you can build a narrative off of it because it's so intuitive. Next argument is teleological, or the design argument. The teleological argument infers a designer from the apparent order, complexity, or fine-tuning observed in the universe, drawing an analogy to designed objects such as Paley's watch. So there's this analogy of a watchmaker. You are walking on a beach and you find a watch, and the watch is so complex and has such an obvious purpose that you infer that somebody must have made the watch. And the argument is put forth that you could reason the same way about the universe itself. It's complex, and it obviously has the ability to have life live inside of it, and therefore it must be designed in some way. I'm making a bit of a leap there. I'm skipping a few premises in that, but that's roughly the idea. Now, the common objection to the design argument is that natural selection is a thing, and it offers a non-intentional explanation for apparent biological design. And critics note that positing a designer raises the further question of what designed the designer. So this comes back to the regress argument. And also, ever since Darwin proposed natural selection, the watchmaker argument is mostly another example of this kind of narrative construction, and it is existentially beautiful, if I can use that word. But the purposes that it serves are more pragmatic, because there are better arguments in this modern day than the watchmaker argument, given natural selection. So the point that needs to be made here is on agency detection and the need for order. A cognitive bias towards detecting intentional agency in ambiguous patterns may partly explain the intuitive pull of design arguments. Existential psychology adds that perceiving order and purpose in the world is also associated with reduced anxiety and a stronger sense of control. When we feel like the world makes sense, that not only motivates us, but it also regulates our emotions. So it gets us to do stuff and it gets us to feel better. The main reason why this argument is held so strongly. Next is the ontological argument. The ontological argument, associated with Anselm, defines God as the greatest conceivable being and argues that existence in reality is a necessary property of such a being, making God's non-existence logically impossible. This is one of the more abstract arguments. It requires us to use our imagination to the best of our ability. Imagination being the internal visual and cognitive stimulus of our brain via the visual pathways and the memory pathways. Main objections to the ontological argument: Immanuel Kant argued that existence is not a predicate that adds to the concept of a thing, while parody versions of the argument, such as Maximally Great Island, illustrate the form's potential to prove absurd conclusions. And the psychology that's relevant to this is dual process theory. That's the System 1, System 2 thing from Daniel Kahneman. System 1 is intuitive and thinks slower. System 2 is deliberate, uses strong reasoning. Purely abstract arguments like the ontological argument tend to engage System 2 and are correspondingly less persuasive to most people. So this is just an interesting sociological phenomenon. When we're doing sort of abstract reasoning, it takes a lot of cognitive resources. Next is the moral argument. The moral argument contends that objective moral values and duties exist, and that their existence is best explained by a transcendent moral lawgiver. This, to me, resembles the idea in metaethical philosophy that it seems incorrect to say that there aren't moral rights and wrongs, goods and evils, and the fact that when two people disagree on something, the fact that they are coming together in order to disagree about it indicates that they're disagreeing about something. So it's sort of a linguistic kind of argument, like the fact that the words are directed at something and the behaviors are also directed at something indicates maybe that something exists. There's a little bit of that in this, although the moral argument is a little bit more distinct than that. Common objections to the moral argument: critics propose evolutionary and social explanations for moral intuitions without reference to a deity. And the Euthyphro dilemma questions whether morality is good because God commands it, or commanded because it is independently good, which is all the same expression of this idea of whether or not there is a moral standard external to human minds. And the psychology behind this is moral intuition and well-being. Moral judgments are often made rapidly and intuitively, with conscious reasoning constructed afterwards. An experiment to kind of elaborate how that can be possible is split brain experiments. People who have their corpus callosum, the highway between the two hemispheres, cut. That's called a corpus callosotomy. When shown two different images on one side or the other, the one side will have, an image of a bird, and the other side will have a word, and the word will be the color red or something. When asked to draw what they see, they only draw what was seen by the one side of the brain. But when asked to speak what they saw, then they read the word that was written on the opposite side. So that's an example of the brain functioning unconsciously. And then when asked about that kind of thing, the rationalization that they give is often not the truth. An instruction written on one half of the piece of paper would tell them to do something. They'd go do it, and then they would come up with a reason why they did it that wasn't that they saw it on a piece of paper. They'd reason that they did it because they wanted to do it, not because the piece of paper said or instructed them to do it. Positive psychology research further links a sense of moral grounding to greater life satisfaction, which may strengthen the felt force of the moral argument independent of its logical merits. Because we feel grounded from moral certainty, we're inevitably going to value that more because it has more existential use to us. It's more pragmatically useful for us when we have some kind of moral certainty, some kind of moral affirmation or confirmation. Argument from religious experience. This argument holds that the widespread occurrence of mystical or religious experiences across cultures constitutes evidence for the existence of a transcendent reality. If so many people have such an experience, and its practical effects of that experience are felt so readily, then there must be some kind of real component at play. What I want to comment on here is reflective listening and religious testimony. When individuals describe religious experience, reflective listening, a technique involving paraphrasing and validating a speaker's account without judgment, is often used by researchers and clinicians. This method can yield rich descriptive data, but its non-evaluative nature also means it does not by itself distinguish between accurate perception and subjective interpretation. With that said, there is a lot going for this line of reasoning because it is, by some standards, one of the most powerful elements to religious belief is religious experience. The experience of living the life, and also experiences that are less explicable than common everyday occurrences. The objections to the religious experience arguments. Neuroscientific studies have identified neural correlates of mystical states that can be induced without religious context, and the content of such experiences varies significantly across cultural and religious frameworks. So religious experience itself is common. The contents of that experience differs from culture to culture. So there is an underlying reality, but it's not the same in its contents, and there are neurological correlates that can be identified. Existential psychology and meaning. Existential psychology proposes that confronting morality and uncertainty motivates a search for meaning. Frameworks such as terror management theory suggest that belief in God can function as a buffer against existential anxiety, independent of the argument's logical validity. There's also something called mortality salience, which when people show higher rates of, have better life outcomes in their behavior. It's kind of like a common question in existential psychotherapy is, if you knew that tomorrow was your last day, how would you spend your last day? What would you want to do? That's the kind of thing that existential psychology and terror management theory is proposing. That's the pragmatic benefit of these frameworks. Pascal's wager. Pascal's wager is a pragmatic rather than evidential argument, proposing that belief in God is the rational choice given the potential costs and benefits associated with belief versus disbelief. You could plot it on a grid, and it would be mapping out the consequences versus benefits of belief versus disbelief in God. And if you do that exercise, not believing in God is either nothing or eternal damnation in hell, something like that. And separateness from God if you're Orthodox. And on the other side, believing in God is either nothing, no result, or life in a heavenly realm. So Pascal's wager is that just off of the odds, it's not worth the risks to not believe. Objections to Pascal's wagers is the quote-unquote many gods objection notes that the wager does not specify which deity to believe in, while the problem of doxastic involuntarism questions whether beliefs can be adopted purely as a matter of choice or self-interest. Is it really worth believing something that you're not convinced by? And also, even if you were convinced, how do you know that your specific religion in question is the appropriate one? That's the objections. In terms of the psychology, motivated reasoning and well-being. Motivated reasoning describes the tendency for prior beliefs and the emotional or existential needs underlying them to shape which evidence and arguments an individual finds compelling, often operating below conscious awareness. So this is what I was talking about earlier. This is not like an anthropological video. It's a dissection of what people say they believe when you ask them. These reasons that they give are mostly ad hoc. Very few people first have the reason and then change to one or other religion. These are motivated reasonings. Motivated reasoning is reasoning for the sake of your interests. It's justifying beliefs that you already had that often come from upbringing and biology more than anything else. Conclusion. Despite centuries of debate, none of these arguments has achieved universal acceptance. Psychology suggests this persistence reflects not only unresolved philosophical questions, but also the cognitive, existential, and well-being related functions that belief and the arguments supporting it can serve for individuals. We all have different reasonings for why we do the things we do, why we believe the things we believe, and of course part of it is philosophy, which is all about being logical and consistent and rational, but there is an underlying co-native load, an emotional, value-laden load operating in an unconscious level. If you liked the video, I'm very glad, and I will see you next time if you decide to come back. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.